Quite a while ago now, I decided to get back into 40k after a very long hiatus, and that was triggered by the new tower update that was coming out at the time. I painted up a huge army in a very short amount of time. I've since sold that army, which I do kind of regret, but at least it was to a friend who's local, and he's adding onto the army very consistently in way of kind of commissioning that through me. I recently painted up a very sizable chunk of models to add on to this force, just to kind of pad out all of the miniatures that weren't there yet. But he finally got his hands on a model that we've both been waiting for a little while, and that's the new Farsight miniature. Now, I have actually painted one of these before. I did one in the classic red scheme, but I was really curious to see how these colors would turn out on the miniature. So I pretty much same day built him and set him up for his paint job in sub-assemblies. I kept his body, legs, shield, 2 arms, his head, and his shoulder pads separate, and at the same time I made the base. Since it was just a single miniature, I could get away with just using some super glue for the sand and then locking it in with a second coat of super glue on top. I don't want to take up too much of your time with this, but before we get into the video, I have to shout out that I've started a Patreon to support this channel. Making these videos does take a lot of time and can be quite costly, so it's greatly appreciated. Members will get to see videos early, will get to vote on topics that I cover, have the ability to send me models to have painted for the channel, as well as join the video project relocation program, where I frequently give away models that I've painted for this channel, like the entirety of my Leviathan Tyrannage that I'm currently painting right now. So please know that your support is greatly appreciated. Thank you for listening, and let's get back into painting Farsight. I primed the entire miniature with Pro Acryl's black airbrush primer, and then went on to some airbrush base coats. So the first coat for this color is Sotek Green, and then we move straight to Gorse Blaster Green from Games Workshop. Tower models are awesome for this kind of work because we can just kind of hold the model at a specific angle and just carefully airbrushing, use those sharp shapes and angles and really just carve out some interesting shadows and gradients across all of the different armor panels. It's one of the reasons they're one of my favorite armies to paint. I then added some ice yellow and Liquitex white ink into the Gorse Blaster Green to create kind of a brighter yet warmer highlight, and just picked out some of the outer edges. And then using Games Workshop's Athematic Blue contrast paint, I did the exact opposite and sprayed a few thin coats to add a little bit of color variation as well as shadow into the miniature. And with that, that's our airbrush base coating done. I then gloss varnished the miniature and pulled out some transfers that I bought a fair while ago that I haven't really used all that much. I absolutely love using transfers across surfaces like Tau battlesuits. The first step is to paint on some microsol, which will soften the decals as they're applied to the surface. After, of course, wetting the decals, I'm able to slide them onto the miniature and just kind of push them around into place. Once that's done, we put some microsol over it, and this really softens and breaks down the transfer film, allows us to manipulate it a bit more. We don't need it as much for this kind of work, but when it comes to things like rounded surfaces, say a Space Marine shoulder pad, it breaks it down and lets you kind of manipulate it to the point where you can get it flat over that kind of curved surface. We then moved on to some oil paints, so I'm using Abteilung 502s. I just mixed some black and some blue-green together, as well as their fast dry thinner. And then since the model's already gloss varnished, I can just go in and tap that oil mixture into all of the little recesses. And as you can see, this is one of my favorite things to do, again, especially with Tau suits, because they're just perfect for it. The oil is just sucked into all of the recesses, and because of the lack of surface tension thanks to the gloss varnish, you can see it just pulls itself across all of these little panels and gaps. Once that was done, because nothing's perfect really, I used a makeup brush with a tiny bit of that same Abteilung 502 fast dry thinner on it, and just went up and cleaned up some of the oils. This is one of the reasons I love oil as well. It's got a massively long working time, so I could have come back and done this step days later. Now I've put some AK Ultra Matte over it, and that's the kind of finish that we've got. Now we can move into some more detail work. Before we go to a brush, I want to do some of the messy stuff first. So I used a sponge with some Gauss Blaster Green. I didn't go crazy with it. There's hardly any paint on the sponge, but I just added some chipping just to kind of variate that panel and make it look a little bit more aged. I then put some Rhinox hide on another little piece of sponge and just went around and tapped all of the outer little edges. I also in some spots used the sponge when it didn't have much paint on it and just quickly swiped it across the paint just to create some little scratches. You could also do this with a thin brush and a steady hand, but I like doing it this way. It kind of looks very messy and unnatural. This is now the most painful and least fun step. I basically just went in and painted everything that's not this blue-green armor color black. Using some Liquitex white ink, I loaded up the airbrush. I'm using inks because it goes through very, very smooth. White paint can be a pain with speckling and just getting a smooth finish, but ink is fantastic. It does dry very quickly on the tip, so I kind of keep having to go back and cleaning it so as it doesn't actually spray out dried ink that's accumulated at the tip of the airbrush. But as you can see, the finish that we get is nice and smooth. Now it's not perfect, of course, because I am using a dry brush, so I'm using some Pro Acryl Black, just painting it into a corner and then just wet blending it out just to kind of re-establish the darker parts that I want there. I then just mixed some white ink in with that same Pro Acryl Black just to create a very light grey, and went around and edge highlighted the entire miniature. I then just, with a slightly brighter mixture as well, just tapped it around where I've airbrushed the white itself just to create a little bit of a gradient in the edge highlighting itself. Again, with some white paint this time, as well as Gauss Blaster Green. I'm using paint instead of the ink because my Gauss Blaster Green is just too thin at the moment. There's not much of it left. I went around and highlighted all of the blue-green armor. Then using some Vallejo model color green gray, I base coated all of the little, I don't know what you'd call them, just the little circular bits, as well as freehanded a couple of nice little racing stripes across him. Adding slightly more white to this mixture, I just did multiple thin layers and built it up until I got to a very near off white kind of color. If you want to avoid mixing white in, you could also use Citadel Colors Deepkin Flesh. It's basically the same end result. Using an airbrush again because I was lazy and I just wanted a smooth result, I base coated the ribbons with some Vallejo Game Color Earth, and then just added more and more white and just used the angles again and sprayed kind of top down to create a little gradient. I then sealed off the arm and base coated the weapon again in a thin layer of black. And then using white ink again to get a smooth transition, I kind of sketched in some non-metallic metal grey. Then using a brush, I added some kind of anime-ish, cartoony looking little streaks of light as well as little scratches. Then using some Pro Acrylic black, I, just like the legs, just kind of re-established those black parts just with a small amount of paint and then wet blending it out. Then using pure white, I just edge highlighted the entire sword. I didn't really know what this part of the end of the weapon is, so I kind of just decided to tie it in with the rest of the army. There are some kind of fluoro magenta bits here and there across them. So I filled it in with white ink again, and then went over it with a single coat of the new game color fluoro magenta. I then picked out the higher raised edges with some straight purple paint. I decided to do the kind of end of this handle part in non-metallic gold, so I base coated the whole thing in Games Workshop's Rhinox hide, and then slowly added in more and more Vallejo model color golden brown. And just, I didn't actually really blend any of this. I just did multiple layers, as you can see, and just kind of tapped it, feathered it out, and created a rough non-metallic gold effect. Once I'd reached pure golden brown, I just added slightly more white through a few more layers and did the exact same thing, just focusing on those outer edges. I then base coated his handle in Games Workshop's Corn Red, and then went over it with a quick wash of the Games Workshop Red Wash. I forget the name of it. It's sculpted quite nicely, so I was able to just use the side of the brush and just quickly highlight it with some Evil Sun Scarlet. Was then on to adding the head and shoulder pad onto the miniature. So I used the same mix of colors as those circular parts just to tie it all together, but did it with an airbrush this time. Once again, taking advantage of the cool shapes and angles, as well as having it in sub-assemblies so as I can create easy gradients with an airbrush. I then gloss varnished it, and it was time again for another oil wash. So I mixed together Abteilung 502's, I forget the name, honestly. It's like a military green as well as some burnt umber, just to create an off gross green, and tapped it into all of the recesses on the head and shoulder. Then just in the same way, just added some chip highlighting with a sponge. It was then time to paint some lenses, so I went in and base coated them all with Vallejo Game Color Violet, and then added some Vallejo Game Color Magenta. Then using slightly more and more white per layer, I kind of just feathered out the outer edges just to create a nice little reflective light effect, as well as some white dots at the top of each lens to simulate a reflection. I decided to do his talisman on his arm in the exact same way as the sword. The only difference was I used one brush load of magenta and then feathered it out from one side to another to create a very quick transition. I then flipped the scheme on the head and shoulder by base coating with a brush with Sotek green, then adding more and more Sotek green, Gorse Blaster green, and then white, just to flip the effect there. And this is how those pieces all look together. At this point, I'm super excited about how he's coming together. It was then time to move on to the base. So I base coated it in the exact same black as before. I wasn't really sure how I wanted to tackle this rock, so I'm not gonna lie, I just kind of winged it with what I had in front of me. I used the exact same green gray as before, and then base coated the outer area in some charcoal brown from Vallejo Model Color. I then used some Vallejo Stonewall Gray and a makeup brush and dry brushed the rock. And then using white, I dry brushed the outer edges of it. I then dry brushed the dirt, I guess you'd call it, with some earth, as well as the trees. I went harder on the dry brush with the trees, but then I changed the tone on the trees as well as dialed them back by adding some contrast paint. I think it was the Agros Dunes. I then base coated all of the little blossoms with that same game color magenta as before, and then added more and more white and built up a bright little highlight on them. Now, this is probably not the best way to do this, but I bought these flowers and just with my hand, you can see I'm just brushing them just to get the little leaves, I guess, off. And I'll collect them all together. Then I just very quickly try to do the rest of the base. So I use some watered down wood glue or PVA and put on the grass. Then I use some snow effects, put that all over. And then before all of that is dried, I desperately try to sprinkle on some of the little blossom looking things so as they stick. They don't always work that well, so sometimes I will put another thin layer of PVA just to kind of lock them in. But I've had a whole army done like this and taken it to many tournaments, and they all still, they all still look great. So it seems to work all right. Then, of course, the most important step is painting the base's rim black. And then I can put the rest of the miniature together and really start to take in how it's come together. This was a relatively quick project, actually. I did it in about 5 hours, I think, from start to finish. Painting tower suits can be very, very streamlined. The airbrush helps a lot, but the shapes and volumes, if you know how to take advantage of them, you can get a very, very fantastic looking result in a very short amount of time. But this scheme adapted fantastically to this model. I decided I wasn't actually done with it. Now, my friend wanted some blood effects on the sword, so I went out and got some Yoo-hoo glue on the weekend, and I tested it out on a Tyranid, and then decided I wanted to throw some streaky, gross blood on him. I'm not sure how I feel about it, but Jack, the new owner of this Farsight, loves it, so that's good. All in all, it was great fun to go back to painting a tower suit like this. I haven't painted one in a good while. It's always a quick paint job, but it's a super rewarding thing to do for me. I've always loved painting these suits. Anyway, if you got anything out of this video, I would really appreciate you liking and subscribing. Make sure to check out my Patreon, and I will see you guys in the next one.